Welcome to our Friday's broadcast of the Gospel Truth. And all of this week, I've been having some special programs with my good friends David and Tim Barton, and I tell you, these guys are a blessing. I wished I knew a tenth of what probably 100th of what they know as far as American history. And so we've just been talking about, celebrating 250 years of this nation, and we've been countering a lot of the things that are said wrong. This is a Christian nation. It was founded by godly people. They weren't perfect people, but they were people who loved God, and they dedicated this nation to the Lord. And so we're trying to set straight some of the things. And so if you don't know about David and Tim Barton, they are the ones that have the Wall Builders ministry. It's 𝗏builders.com. You have a museum that we were talking just a minute ago, that it's at a minimum of $5 million worth of original documents and things that they have. It's phenomenal. If I'm not mistaken, it's the largest privately owned amount of documents, original documents in the nation. Is that correct?
From the founding era, it is, yes, sir.
Yeah.
And there's other collectors that have larger collections, but not of founding fathers' documents.
Yeah. And so anyway, it's been wonderful what we're talking about. Let me just mention quickly that we have CDs and DVDs that are taken directly from our television program, and then we have a USB with both the audio and the video on there, and we'll be offering that at the end of the program. Also, if you go to 𝗏builders.com, they got a lot of material. They got videos there, they got educational things there, and just a lot of stuff, and I encourage you to please be a part of that and support what they're doing. So we've already talked about the Jamestown colony versus the Plymouth colony, and that the Plymouth colony was more godly in the sense that they weren't influenced by the kings. Anyway, I don't want to go back through all that, but we've talked about those things. Then we talked about the founding fathers, and we're going to continue to talk along these lines and talk about the Declaration and the Constitution. And one of the things we're wanting to get across is that this is a Christian nation. It was founded by godly people, not perfect people, but godly people who dedicated this nation to the Lord. It's reflected in these documents. And so let's just start talking about this and counter a lot. A lot of people say these are secular documents.
Before we do that, I want to take what you just said, this Christian nation. It's interesting, depends on how you define that, but I will say that's not just you saying that. We have 4 U.S. Supreme Court cases where the Supreme Court itself said this is a Christian nation. We have dozens and dozens, literally hundreds of state Supreme Courts and federal courts and courts of appeal make the same thing. So today, when I say that, Tim says that, you said, oh, you guys, you're just making that up. No, this is hundreds.
Well, you're a Christian nationalist.
See, that's the other thing, is a Christian nationalist.
What's wrong with being a Christian and for this nation? I'm proud of this.
It's important to make a distinction that America's Christian nation is not like any European Christian nation, because that was coercive. The king says you're going to be a Christian, and here's the denomination you have. We were by choice. And it inculcated our culture, and it inculcated. We talked about pilgrims, but we didn't talk about the fact that there were 5 Bible verses used to create the free market system. So our economic system, it comes out of the Bible. The things we teach, we're talking even about the due process, how so much of that comes out of the Bible. So the Bible has shaped so much of the culture. We are a Christian nation by voluntary choice. And that's what makes us so different from any other in the world.
And this is something, too, going back to where we started earlier this week with Jamestown and Plymouth, going through George Whitefield, the other noted leaders, the First Great Awakening to the Founding Fathers. What is historically not really even challengeable is the Bible was the most influential document in our founding, from the very first colonies up to the Founding Fathers, which is kind of where we are now. But one of the things we didn't get into a lot, but we teased it a little bit with like a George Whitefield, the most influential document was the Bible, but the most influential voices were the pastors. And today, most Americans have not learned that, but this is something historians documented for generations and maybe even centuries. We have lots of different examples. This is just one called They Preach Liberty. It highlights some of the pastors that were very involved, but one of my favorites, we didn't bring it with us this trip, is from Alice Baldwin. She wrote a book called The New England Clergy and the American Revolution. And it's really great because her book came out in 1928. And by way of background, she's also the one that started the Women's Program at Duke University. She was a professor there in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And I'm saying this to give context. She was a really big deal academically speaking, like a very noted figure, historian. In 1928, when she writes this book about the influence of pastors in early America, one of the things she starts off with is that we're in the progressive era now, she says, and these modern professors, they're ignoring one of the most fundamental parts of America's beginning. And it's also interesting because when progressives took over, a lot of things changed in education. And she's acknowledging they're leaving out one of the most important parts.
And when was this? What day?
1928.
Wow. Boy, she would roll over to her grave today, wouldn't she?
But so in this book, she highlights that pastors were the most influential voice on the founding fathers. But why I love her book specifically, and there's a lot of professors that have written books like this that we can point to, but her book, it's 170 something pages. The last 5 pages, she has a conclusion, and people can look up online. You can look up Alice Baldwin's The New England Clergy and the American Revolution, go to googlebooks.com and go to the conclusion, the last 5 pages. And in the last 5 pages, I'm going to give a quote from it and then give some explanation. She says, there's not a right asserted in the Declaration which had not first been preached by the American clergy prior to 1763, which is more than a dozen years before the Declaration. But what she goes on further to say in her, and I'm saying the conclusion because you don't have to read all 170 pages. If you just read the conclusion where she gives you the high level highlights of it, she says, the founding fathers actually didn't come up with any unique ideas themselves. They were repeating the ideas that had been permeating their culture because of their pastors. And what is, again, my favorite thing about her book is not just a conclusion. At the end of the conclusion, there's an appendix. In the appendix, it's actually a listing where it will have the name of a pastor and it will have a paragraph from his sermon that has the right that showed up in the Declaration. She's literally giving the receipts for what they did. And why I say that is because when we talk about America being a Christian nation, when you can historically, unequivocally show the Bible is the #1 influential document in all of the early formation of America, and the most influential voice was pastors, well, what else were you going to be? This is the only option.
And I've heard you quote, I think, that there's dozens of sermons referenced in the Declaration and stuff that they're referring to.
Well,
things that they got
even the
sermons.
thinking in general, because if you go back to the American Revolution, all right, it kind of starts with the Stamp Act in 1765, and then we get into Boston Tea Party later. But in the midst there, the guy that we kind of credit as being the father of the American Revolution is Samuel Adams. And so Sam Adams, as this thing is starting to develop, now he's up in Massachusetts, but he realizes we got to get all 13 states involved. He comes up with the Committees of Correspondence. And Committees of Correspondence is the Paul Revere News Network in your state. Let's all deliver the same information to all of our citizens in all 13 of the colonies. And one of the pieces that they printed and distributed was in 1772. And
the first one.
The first one.
It was the first Committee of Correspondence, and this matters even more because it wasn't like they're just saying this somewhere along the way. No, the starting place for the founding fathers. Literally the first thing Sam Adams thinks, if we're going to all be together, this is what everybody has to know. This is his starting place.
So he starts with the sermons of the Reverend John Wise, and he reprints 2 famous sermons, one from 1710, one from 1717. And John Wise stood up against British tyranny back in the late 1600s, early 1700s, when you had really some bad governors coming in and trying to force the people of Massachusetts to do things that was not within their purview. So that sermon, but out of that sermon, this is a preacher who preached that taxation without representation is tyranny. So we have that in the Declaration. That came out of the sermon, 70 years earlier, 60 years earlier. The consent of the governed. That's another phrase out of his. So there's so many phrases in the Declaration that came out of the sermons, and the Committees of Correspondence printed that and distributed all over all 13 states. And so that's part of how they got the continuity in thinking was through the sermons.
Well, and I actually thought, you were going to say that the Sam Adams, the Committee of Correspondence that he printed, the first one that went out was from the notes in Boston. And that's where I thought you were going when I said the first one, because the sermons, they did distribute John Wise's sermons, because also in John Wise's sermon is where the phrase comes from that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator That's what a pastor had been teaching, that our rights don't come from the government. They don't come from the king or the governor.
So Jefferson and these people were quoting sermons.
Verbatim quoting.
Sermons.
Well,
which would have been understood at the day.
Which tells you what they've been reading, too.
Yes.
Because you can't quote what you haven't been reading.
Yeah.
Well, I guess you can hear it from everybody else, but still, it came from
Somebody's been reading it.
Somebody's been reading it.
And along those lines. So the first thing Committee of Correspondence sends out, Sam Adams is the author of the very first Committee of Correspondence. And it was something they were distributing to the colonies. It had 3 parts. It was the rights of the colonists as men, the rights of the colonists as Christians, and the rights of the colonists as British subjects. And what he was pointing out is the king has trampled our rights no matter how you measure them. He's rejecting our rights as men. He's rejecting our rights as Christians. And they actually did suspend the British Bill of Rights, where they rejected basic British law for the colonies. And he said he's rejecting every standard. But what's so fun about the section, the rights of the colonists as Christians, his opening line is, these may be best understood by reading and carefully studying the great lawgiver, the head of the church, which would be found clearly promulgated in the New Testament. Well, that's Jesus. So he says, if you want to understand what's happening, go read the 4 Gospels, study Jesus, and you would see that what's happening around us is not right. When your starting place is that if we would just all read the Bible together, right? Again, this is not a secular movement they are doing. This is something inspired by the Bible, influenced by pastors, and the challenge and call was, let's read more of these sermons from pastors. Let's go back and read our Bible more. The movement was birthed out of Christianity and the influence of Christianity. And when people question it today, I would challenge, not that like you couldn't read the Bible and have a different interpretation of it, but when you use the Bible to interpret the Bible and you're like, now you're saying that, but there's way more context the Bible gives. That's what we would say with the Christian heritage.
And am I correct in that the average person, even if they weren't Christians in those days, had a Christian influence on them, that they took everything in that context? Well, wasn't it John Adams that said that the democracy is wholly unfit for anybody but a religious people?
Yeah, our Constitution. Our Constitution was made only for moral and religious people. But let's back up, because one of the things they talked about, and I think it was John Adams who said, you're more likely to find a comet in the night sky than an uneducated or uncivilized American. Wasn't that John Adams? Because the highest literacy rate anywhere in the world at that time was in New England states, in the colonies, and the fact that they're literate doesn't necessarily mean they're students of the Bible, except, well, guess where they learn to read from?
Andrew will be right back after these messages.
Hello, this is Andrew, and I would like to encourage you to join with us and become a partner with us. You know, you can click right there on the screen, and that will take you directly to one of the links on our website where you can sign up and become a partner. You can call our helpline. The number will be on the screen. We're open 24/7, and we'll help you any way we can. And you can also scan the QR code, and that will also take you to where you can join with us and become a partner and help us to reach more people, reach farther and deeper with the gospel than we ever have before.
And now, here's Andrew.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, you guys are the authorities, but they started this education because they wanted their people to be able to read the Bible. And
Number
have the
one
influence.
reason, the only way you can stop tyranny is to know what the Bible says.
Yeah.
And so from the very beginning, that law that we looked at earlier in the week, the Old Diluter Satan Act, was because the Old Diluter Satan wants to keep us from knowing the Scriptures, which lets government do all the wrong things. And so all the way back, I mean, to that 1650 code, when they passed the law in 1647, 1643, but it's in the code of 1650. It was all about the Bible. And even if you take the Founding Fathers, we talked a little earlier that maybe the 2 least religious, at least the way people call it today, is Jefferson and Franklin. Okay, Jefferson, when he becomes president of the United States, he's the first president to get a full term in Washington, D.C. Our first year was in Philadelphia, the next 10 years is in New York. And so now we're moving to D.C. John Adams was there for just a few weeks, and then Jefferson gets it. Jefferson, by Constitution, D.C. can never become a state. People want D.C. statehood. You're going to have to get a constitutional amendment for that to happen. Can't be. So what that means is the president is in charge of Washington, D.C. That's the federal city. And that's why Trump has talked about, I'm going to take over the police and get the crime stopped and et cetera. He can do that. Jefferson, when he becomes president of the United States, is made the president of the school board for Washington, D.C. public schools. So Jefferson's now the U.S. president and the school board president. And in his plan of education that he authored, he put in 2 books for reading. One is the Bible, and one was Isaac Watts' hymnal, which is the Psalms of the Bible in different versions. So their whole thing was you got to know the Bible. You will not, and that's the least religious founding father.
And so this whole thing where they kicked prayer out of the schools and Bible reading and things, and we've got a guy in Colorado that got suspended and kicked out because he had a Bible on his desk, a teacher. And stuff. So that is completely contrary to the way we started.
It is. And we talked a little bit earlier this week about Franklin and some of his faith evidences that are not what we think today, where he's the one at the Constitutional Convention who said, we need to pray and ask God for help or this won't work. Well, we can go further because we also, was it just yesterday we were talking about the Great Awakening? With the Great Awakening, the fact that Franklin and Whitefield become good friends, one of the fun things that Franklin actually writes is the influence that Whitefield has had in Philadelphia, where he is. He said, I can't walk the street at night without seeing families walking together and they're singing hymns.
Yeah.
He said, I can't go anywhere and not hear people singing these hymns. But he says, it's wonderful what's happening. Well, this is not just the really religious people. This is permeating the whole culture in America. And it doesn't mean everybody's a Christian, but it means Christianity is influencing everybody in the culture. So much so that the founding fathers, when we do finally end up separating from Great Britain, and we can come back to the Declaration in a second, but on the table in front of us, we have so many examples that what the founding fathers do as leaders is, Dad, you're grabbing proclamations. Let's start with that one. That's a super easy or fun example. Let's bring it on this side. So this is a prayer proclamation done from John Hancock, who was the first governor of Massachusetts once we separate from Great Britain. He had 22 different proclamations, calls for prayer, and this one is for fasting, humiliation, and prayer. So in this specific instance, there were 2 kinds of proclamations. One was for prayer and thanksgiving, one was for prayer and fasting. But he's calling on a state to a day that we're going to humble ourselves and we're going to ask God to intervene. Well, part of what he says we're praying for, he says, calling upon ministers and people of every denomination to assemble on that day and their respective congregations, that with true contrition of heart, we may confess our sins, resolve to forsake them, and implore the divine forgiveness through the merits and mediation of Jesus Christ, our Savior. And Jesus Christ is fully capitalized.
Amen.
So
that's awesome.
I don't think I've heard a pastor call for that. And that's the governor of Massachusetts, and 22 proclamations he did.
And every single founding father, Dad, as you're pulling more out, every single founding father that goes on to become governor, we have yet to find a founding father that became governor who did not issue prayer proclamations. So this was just standard practice.
That's Sam Adams there. So father of the revolution. But there are 1,400 prayer proclamations by the time you get to 1815. This one is from John Adams, President of the United States. And by the way, this is the President calling for a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer. So President of the United States, this is Caesar Rodney. Caesar Rodney is a signer of the Declaration. He is in Delaware. This one
cast the deciding vote for independence.
If you've seen the Delaware Quarter with the guy galloping on a horseback, that's Caesar Rodney. And then this one is Washington's first federal proclamation. This is a Thanksgiving proclamation by George Washington right there.
And I've seen the Constitution of all of the original colonies, and every single one of them made reference to the Lord, that they were committed to the Lord, and many of them you couldn't hold public office unless you professed it to believe in the Bible and in Jesus Christ.
Franklin helped write the Pennsylvania Constitution. And that's literally in the Pennsylvania Constitution. And Franklin is actually credited with helping put that in, that you couldn't hold office if you didn't believe there was one God that created the universe, that he rewarded the good, he punished the wicked. And if you didn't believe the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration, then you can't hold office in Pennsylvania.
So the people that say separation of church and state, how do they're either ignorant of this or they're just totally lying about it.
They're ignorant, but this is where propaganda works really well. And we've had
especially
progressive
to the uneducated.
Yes, that's right. We've had progressive propaganda since 1947. So what you have is Jefferson wrote 27,000 letters and pieces. One of the letters he wrote January the 1st, 1802, and it's the one that has the phrase separation of church and state. It's not in any of his other letters. It's in one out of 27 letters. and it's 8 words out of 233 word letter. Now, how does a guy with 27,000 letters, with long letters, how do you take an 8-word phrase and make that the only thing people have ever heard about Jefferson? And we just talked about Jefferson put the Bible in public schools.
When it comes to his religious expression, because I
That's
would
right.
argue there's things they know about Jefferson
That's true.
as far as him being a bad guy, and we can come back to some of that in a minute.
But also that Danbury Baptist that he was talking to, if you read it in context, it's
Correct.
not separation like
no.
anti-God.
Right.
No, he's saying because of this, you have complete religious freedom, full public expression. The government's not going to stop. Separation of church and state meant the government would not stop a public religious
Hey,
expression.
what day did he write that?
He wrote that January the 1st, 1802, which was a Friday.
A Friday. So 2 days later would be January 3rd. Where was he on January 3rd?
Sunday. Oh, I remember this one. So what happened was when Jefferson, we talked about how that they moved into Washington, D.C., he's the first president of full term. The Capitol building is brand new. It's very small compared to what it is today. But they said, in the Constitution, we have the Sundays Accepted Clause, which say you can't do work on the Sabbath. Most people didn't know that's in the Constitution.
No, I didn't.
And so the Sundays Accepted Clause, that's why we don't deliver mail on Sundays. So,
Didn't used to.
yeah. So what he said was, the biggest room we have in the Capitol is the House of Representatives. Why don't we have church in there every Sunday? So they started having church in the Hall of House of Representatives every Sunday. Jefferson signed off on that along with 𝗖𝗏𝗏 Sedgwick, Speaker of the House. And then that's where Jefferson went to church all his years as president at the Capitol. And on January the 3rd, 1802, 2 days after he writes this letter, he invites Reverend John Leland to come preach at the Capitol. Now, wait a minute, I thought you just did separation. No. Separation means the government won't stop a religious activity. And so when you read the whole letter and you look at all of Jefferson's actions, totally opposite to what
His
we get.
actions speak louder than words.
Yeah.
So the guy who was the architect of the Constitution by his actions showed that there was no separation.
And let me hit the propaganda side of this, because when you go into federal court, you're arguing under the Constitution. So what they'll do is they'll quote the Constitution or they'll quote the federal statute or whatever to set the tone for what you're doing. Since about 1970, there have been 4,000 cases dealing with the First Amendment, dealing with religious expression. So there's 4,000 cases that cited Jefferson's 8 words, a wall of separation between church and state. There's only 3,000 cases that cited the Constitution. So Jefferson cited more often than the Constitution, and they use that as if it is the Constitution. They took an oath to uphold the Constitution, not an 8-word phrase, and that 8-word phrase is totally out of context.
And Jefferson even acknowledged that he had nothing to do with the construction of the Constitution. He was in Europe when it happened. So he's the guy that wrote the Declaration. He didn't write the Constitution. And the fact that now he's the constitutional expert, it's only because it's a convenient narrative
That's right.
for the modern
It's the
thought.
ungodly looking for a loophole.
That's right.
And
Correct.
they use this.
And they do it really well when we don't know the truth. I mean, this is what the Pharisees did in Jesus' day. If you don't know what the Bible actually says and don't know the truth, you can get in some really bad practices. And America has become a very secular nation as a result of absolute untruths, because we didn't get this in school, we weren't taught this, and we didn't seek it out for ourselves.
I'd like to encourage you to get some of these products that we're offering. We're giving away this book entitled The Great Awakening. This is 3 prophecies the Lord gave me about how that we're already in a great awakening. And I'm giving this away as a free gift, free and post-paid. And then we also have the programs from these 2 weeks that I did with David and Tim Barton. And I have CDs, DVDs, and then we also have the USB that will have the audio and the video on there. If you'll listen, our announcer will give you all this information, and please call or write today.